here. I'm Ceceila. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Iowa, where I obtained my Bachelor's of Arts in Criminology, Law, and Justice. And until recently, I was a server here at Scotty's. And today, I'm going to give you all a presentation on juvenile justice. I worked with this project with Professor Karen Heimer in the criminology department at the university. And so for this project, this was the second project I did with Professor Heimer. And the first project was more about policing and adult incarceration, and that was really interesting. But she asked me if I wanted to continue doing research with her when that project was over. And I was very excited to continue doing the research.
A little louder, please.
Lindsay? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So Professor Heimer and I sort of set out to find a new topic to research. And she told me about a project that she did in the UK that addressed juvenile incarceration, specifically in regard to race and ethnicity. And I thought that was super interesting. So we decided to go ahead and find some data to work with, because finding primary data would probably be much more complicated. So we started out with data from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. They had tons of data about everything, from incarceration to arrest, and categories of age, sex, race, and so there was a lot to dig through. So we sort of took a step back, because juvenile incarceration is not something that we have particular classes about at the university. So I didn't have a very detailed or broad knowledge of juvenile incarceration. So with help from Professor Heimer, we found some really good things to read about so that we have a better understanding of the whole topic. And after that, we sort of moved forward and decided that incarceration data from the OJJDP would be the best to work with. It was already in rates per 100,000, which was really nice because it's a lot easier to conceptualize things in rates. But the downside of that is that we were hoping to compare it to arrest data, so we could see if there was any sort of discrepancies between the rates when looking at different race ethnicities. Was it happening at the front end of the system when youth were arrested, or was it happening at the back end when they were sort of going through court and sentenced? Unfortunately, the arrest data was not in rates, so we didn't necessarily have enough time to compare. But the arrest data was helpful when looking at the overall trend of what was happening. So as soon as we found all this data and started putting it together, we noticed that for all different categories of crime, for all races and ethnicities, there was a downward trend. And that sort of matches up with what we know is happening with the adult incarceration system. And it also matches up with what we know has been the great crime decline. And this crime decline has been happening through the 90s and the early 2000s, specifically for violent crime. And so on the left here, we have the rate per 100,000 of incarceration of all juveniles for all crimes, divided by race and ethnicity. And we can see here that everything is a downward trend, which once again matches up with what we know that crime is declining. And then the graph on the right is the amount of juveniles arrested. This is not in a rate, this is the total number. But it just sort of confirms for us that there is an overall decline, and it's not just a decline in incarceration. I wanted to start out with talking about different racial and ethnic categories with white and Asian youth. White Asian youth throughout most of the series for different crime categories had about the same rate of incarceration, which is kind of what we would like to see. Is sort of no matter what the sex or race, that there is a similar rate of incarceration. And so because of that, this project ended up not focusing a lot on Asian youth, because we were already seeing really positive things happening with them having an overall low rate of incarceration. And so we decided to put all of our focuses into Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth, because those were sort of the groups that stood out as having a different rate of incarceration. I wanted to start out in regard to those three categories of race and ethnicity, discussing Black youth. And I think that that's sort of a narrative that a lot of us are familiar with. A lot of adult incarceration papers and academia about race and ethnicity kind of focuses on the difference in incarceration between white and black adults. And that's sort of the narrative that we're used to hearing in class when discussing race and ethnicity, specifically in regards to the criminal justice system. It's sort of where the most studies have been done, and I think it's sort of something that we're all familiar with. And so there was a few things that were happening with the rates of incarceration for black youth. One of the most positive things that's happening is that the rate of incarceration was coming down significantly. In sort of this period of time that we're looking at, which is from 1997 to 2019, there were some policies put in place that were sort of in the hopes that they would overall decline the rate of incarceration for youth and sort of maybe get some of these youth into community programs, probation, house arrest type things, and just overall keep kids out of jail. And some of these policies also specifically were meant to help youth of color. And so what we're seeing here is really positive, that not only are black youth, along with all other youth, getting a lower rate of incarceration, but the gap between black youth and white youth is also closing. So the rates are becoming more similar, which is definitely a positive aspect. Something else that's interesting is that throughout most of the crimes, throughout most of the series, as we can see here with violent crime and property crime, which are the two broadest categories given, that black youth had the highest rate of incarceration almost the entire time, which also is something that we see similarly in the adult system. The next group that we're going to talk about is Latinx youth. This was super interesting and a very positive note. So with Latinx youth, there was a few interesting things happening, but the most interesting one of all was a dramatic change from 1997 to 2019. In 1997, there was a pretty large gap between white youth and Latinx youth in all categories of crime. And this was pretty much the same as with black and indigenous youth. But moving forward, we saw that come 2019, a lot of these gaps have closed. Some entirely, some not. And violent crimes are always sort of the most talked about, murder, robbery, the things that most people are really concerned about. And so this graph here doesn't show the rate of incarceration, it shows the gap between the rates of incarceration. And so this sort of orange-red line is the gap between the rate of incarceration for violent crimes for white youth and Latinx youth, and it goes from 84, which is pretty significant, to only 5. So there was only 5 out of those 100,000 different. And so for some other crime categories, the gap was 0, which means that Latinx youth and white youth had the exact same rate of incarceration. So that's incredibly positive. That's what we want to see happening. It was really only for the last year or two of this data, which ended in 2019. So we can kind of just hope that when this is updated, that trend is just continuing, because that's really what we want to see. It's also important to note that Latinx youth had a lower rate of incarceration for pretty much all crimes in comparison to black and indigenous youth. And this is where the main focus of our project ended up being. We found that we weren't horribly surprised by a lot of things that we found until we started focusing on indigenous youth. And so what we started to see was that these overall downward trends with all crime categories and all racial and ethnic categories didn't seem to be applying the same way with indigenous youth. And so I've picked 2 specific crime types to talk about. One of them is drug offenses, which are ones that are particular to pay attention to because as some of the readings that I cited in the beginning had explained, drug offenses are sort of a tell-all to who is going to re-offend or what youth are going to end up in the adult incarceration system. It's sort of seen as more connected to mental health or behavioral issues, which can certainly continue. And so it's interesting to see here that for white, Asian, Latinx, and black youth, this rate is continuously going down. Some of the policies put in place in the 90s were specifically to address drug use, and some of them in youth. So this is kind of what you would expect to see, but as you can also tell, this yellow line is doing something completely different. It sort of raises and lowers and raises up again. And one thing that's interesting is this is one of the only, these two graphs are some of the only ones in the series where Black youth were not at the highest rate for the entire series. So in 2010, for drug offenses, Indigenous youth rate of incarceration surpasses Black youth, which is also something that's really interesting. And as we can see, towards the end, towards 2019, this rate comes down, but this sort of just affirms for us that something different is happening with incarceration regarding Indigenous youth. And the second graph is very stark, if you ask me. This is the rate for status offenses, and I've included the definition of status offense because it's very important to understand why this matters so much. So status offenses are non-criminal offenses. They're only an issue for youth because you can't do it underage, like staying out past a curfew if your town has one, underage drinking, things that are usually very small and non-violent. And status offenses were never meant to be incarcerated. They were meant to be sort of a slap on the hand or a warning, an introduction to the system to say, this could cause you serious trouble down the road. As we can see, all youth of all race and ethnicities are incarcerated for status offenses, very much in particular Indigenous youth. And this could be for a multitude of reasons. We don't really know why. One thing to consider is that Indigenous youth who live on reservations have access to a different law enforcement system. This could be happening in arrests. They might be being arrested more frequently in reservation type settings. It could be issues involving the courts. You know, maybe they're more often being convicted and sentenced to incarceration. It's hard to tell if we don't know. But it's certainly an interesting narrative that all of these efforts that are being put in to help youth, and even youth of color, don't seem to be helping Indigenous youth the same way. And then I just wanted to sort of step back and reiterate that the narratives for what's happening with youth of color are not the same, which is why I felt it was important to have a different page for sort of each of these racial and ethnic categories, because this was a really stark comparison from Professor Heimer's other project. In the UK, sort of the categories for race and ethnicity are different, and one of those ways that data is collected is simply white and minority. So a lot of her studies sort of focused on many racial and ethnic groups that were all just considered minority. So then comparing this to her work that she had already done was extremely interesting, because we found that these trends do not look the same, even when you're considering all youth of color. And then, in conclusion, I wanted to reiterate that Black youth, the incarceration rate, is making incredibly positive strides. If these trends continue, then we should sort of see what we want to, which is that all rates of incarceration, despite race and ethnicity, would be similar. As I said before, there are tons of positives happening with Latinx youth. If we just continue what was happening in 2019, which hopefully it has, I wish I knew. If that simply continues, then that would be incredible. There will always be some differences in the rates every year, but you know, that sort of difference of 5 is extremely small, which we discussed earlier with violent crime. And then with Indigenous youth, we're seeing some more interesting things. You know, maybe they need different policies in place to particularly help them. Maybe they need more resources for lawyers. Maybe it's issues coming from other differences, whether it be income or childcare or whatever it may be. But it seems that that's an area where maybe more support can be needed. And another thing that I just want to reiterate is that this research focused on incarceration, and we were not able to compare this to arrest, which means that wherever these disparities lie, we have no idea where they're coming from. They could be coming from the initial arrest, they could be coming from the court system, they could be coming from sentencing. There is not any way for us to tell from this research that we did, and this image just sort of reiterates that. This is the case flow for 1,000 delinquent cases in 2016, which is a little bit outdated. But this is after arrest, all the different things that can happen to juveniles. And out of these 1,000, we have talked about these 78 youth today. These are ones who are incarcerated. And these are all other forms of punishment that can happen. So incarceration is just one thing to focus on of many. There could be a bajillion different things happening. We don't know. Yeah, thank you. Question, Molly?
Yeah, sure. So Ceceila, what are your plans now, career-wise?
Well, last week I was in Chicago and I visited the University of Illinois Chicago's campus, and I enjoyed it a lot. And I learned more about the public policy program, and I am really excited to send them an application. So that's that, and I'm hoping to get to Colorado sometime to visit the University of Colorado Denver's campus, because they have a really good program too. So in fall of next year, I'm hoping to be in a master's program for public policy, and then go from there.
Another question is, how did these statistics you just showed us were national, right?
Yes, they're for all the U.S.
How does Iowa compare with some of the national stats?
That's a good question. Iowa has a little bit different data. It's hard to compare, and part of that is because over time, some individual organizations or parts of the government have changed their definitions of race and ethnicity. So Iowa has more recently changed the way that they take in data for Latinx and Indigenous youth. It was changed in the early 2000s. So we peeked at that data. It was not like obviously the focus, but when we looked at it, it was pretty hard to compare because there were pretty stark jumps in numbers around when those definitions were changed. But overall, pretty similar things are happening. Rates are going down, specifically for violent crimes too. Sarah?
I really hadn't realized that rates of incarceration had gone down that much. What were some of the public policies, or I don't know, that led to that?
One of the biggest ones was, well, a few of them were from the JJDPA, but there were tons and tons of them. I was amazed by how much change had happened in the system in the past, like, 30 years. I wish I could, like, rattle off some of them for you, but there were so many that, like, we had to get an Excel file and, like, put them in and what they did and everything. And part of that was because there was sort of this huge realization in the 70s that there was a huge amount of mistreatment happening in incarceration with youth. There was tons, like one juvenile detention center in Florida was brought to court for an abuse case, and then like tons and tons of youth who had recently, within the past like 5 to 10 years, been out of incarceration were coming forward and sharing their stories, and tons of places all over the U.S. were suddenly in abuse cases for juvenile incarceration. And then the entire system like completely remade itself. They shut down like tons and tons of places all across the U.S. that were juvenile detention centers, and sort of redid all of them based off of this one detention center in Michigan that had sort of a value of rehabilitation. And so that was one of the things that happened. That wasn't even because of the policy, it was just because of going to court. And then there was a lot of policies that were put in place afterwards to kind of ensure that that just continued. Yeah. Yes.
Have you seen any studies that put a variable in on whether the father was present in the household for incarcerated kids or adults?
We've read some in class about adults, but I don't know of any that are about youth. If there are, I have not read them, but I know that there are some regarding adults in the system and whether or not they were raised in a single or two-parent household. I have lots of hands everywhere. I don't know who was first. Okay, low.
So your data was for people under 18 or 18 and under?
Yep, it was, which encompassed most youth. There's a small percentage of youth who are sent to adult incarceration, which were not included in this data set. The data is recorded like from the detention centers and reported to the government every year. So if a youth was sentenced to adult incarceration, they were not included in this, but it's not a very large amount, is my understanding. Yeah.
You did a survey, I believe.
Yes.
With regard to crime in the neighborhood, including Oakville.
Yes.
What did you find in the survey?
Okay, so many of you here don't know about this. During this project also, my last semester, we had to pick a neighborhood and study the crime rate in that neighborhood. And I picked Oakville's main campus as my neighborhood because we had to provide historical context, and Oakville East doesn't have a very long historical context. So I chose the Oakville main campus, for those of you at East who don't know that I did this. So I put surveys in everybody's mailboxes to find out sort of what the crime rate was. The crime rate in Oakville is very, very low, if you were wondering. Yeah, most people reported that they didn't know of any crimes, and they weren't victim of any crimes, but you know, there were several thefts, all of which were near an exit door. All of the residents who reported that. All near an exit. That is what I found. I can send that to you if you'd like. I'm happy with it. That was a little bit longer read though. That was a long project.
Can you go back and the people by the exit doors reported that they were worried about crime or there was crime?
There was a few people who reported that they had things stolen, all of which lived like right by an exit.
You mentioned some of the factors in terms of public policy that have resulted in a decrease in incarceration among youth.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think would be some of the changes in policy that might result in a further decrease?
Well, that's a good question, and I think part of that question is whether or not that's what you want. I mean, to some degree, I think a lot of people want incarceration as an option, but that just kind of depends on what your views are of the criminal justice system. Some people are very anti-incarceration and they want all forms of rehabilitation. But sort of what we're seeing with the Asian, white, and Latinx youth currently is what most people, I shouldn't say most people, most of my professors have said is sort of the goal for a lot of people who work in criminology. So sort of the rates that we're looking at right now for those Asian, white, and Latinx youth is my understanding. It's kind of like where we would want to be moving forward, especially considering the actual crime rate that we have now. So if the crime rate went up substantially, which I don't know if that would happen, but if the crime rate went up substantially, then those numbers could rise. But I think in comparison to the amount of crime that we have right now, it's sort of where we would want it to be. Yes.
Have you seen any data for the last 2 years? Has that trend going downward continued?
No, this was like the most recent data. We looked at some other places that provided data about juvenile incarceration, but once we went through sort of reading page that explains where the data came from, and they have sort of that information always about the statistics of it. Academically, it was very apparent that this was the only place that we wanted to get our quantitative data from, but it only went up until 2019, so we didn't look at any data past that. But I hope that there's good things happening right now. Yeah, Barb?
Don't you think the pandemic might have some impact on that?
Yeah, I imagine so. I'm not sure in what way though. I can imagine that in some ways crimes might have gone up for youth, but I also imagine in some ways a lot of youth were probably spending more time at home with their parents and it seems like the least likely place to find trouble, at least for me. So, I mean, maybe, but not sure. Yeah, Mary?
Did you come across any statistics or variables that would indicate that gang activity had any impact on incarceration rates and the gaps between the ethnicities?
Not necessarily in regard to the data that we found, although it was definitely in some of those readings and articles that I read, particularly with Black and Latinx youth. But part of the reason that was hard to address, as you hopefully saw, is that very different things are happening with Black and Latinx youth. Those two groups had pretty similar amounts of gang activity under 18. But they had very different things happening with incarceration. So I had a hard time making conclusions that were related to that. So we didn't necessarily find a conclusion between gang activity and incarceration. Margaret?
So incarceration, probably these youth have either had a very long history of crime, or they were involved in a very violent crime.
Yeah, I mean, incarceration is definitely not the first step, so it was not far off to think that the youth who ended up incarcerated probably were in some sort of trouble before. But the data is just how many youth are incarcerated at that time for that year, so it doesn't include any history of which ones were reoffenders, if it was their second offense or whatnot. But yes, I would assume that many of these youth probably had been in trouble before, and, you know, maybe had already been through some of these other options before incarceration was on the table. Yes.
Do you think you'll continue focusing your research in this area, or maybe policy changes, or have you thought about that when you get your master's?
Yeah, I'm really excited to continue going to school and learn about policy. It wasn't something that I got to learn about very much in my undergraduate studies, and I think it would be really interesting to continue working with youth. There's a huge focus in criminology on the adult system, which, you know, is also something very important, but I think that there's much less talk about what's happening with youth who are incarcerated. I think it's a very interesting topic, and I would not mind continuing to learn and work with it.
There aren't that many undergraduates who do research. How did you seek it out, or did somebody notice that you were promising and seek you out, or what happened?
Actually, what happened is I called, I talked to my advisor, and I said, I have no idea what the heck I want to do with that when I graduate, and I only have like a year and a half left, which, you know, is a while, but also, you know, I felt like it was creeping up on me. And she said, I'm going to hook you up with this professor who teaches undergraduate and graduate classes, Professor Heimer. And I met with her, and I said, what did you do for grad school? What did you do? What do you like about your job? All those sorts of good things. And then she immediately invited me onto a project she had already started. So she invited me onto a project about policing, incarceration, and mental health, which was super interesting. They had already done a lot of the background research, but they were about to go do like interviews with the police officers and things like that. And she said that she think I would be a great fit to help her team interview people. So she just met me one day and asked me if I wanted to join, and I said, yes, I do. And yeah, and then we were hoping to do a different project instead of this one actually, but that didn't work out because of COVID, and it involved more in-person interviews. Yes.
What about the youth who are transferred to adult court? They're not on that graph, are they?
Correct, yeah.
Now, is it possible that if you're transferred to adult court, the crimes you've committed are more serious?
Yeah, so generally when youth are transferred to adult systems, it's for violent crimes that are particularly serious, and it's usually only if they have a pretty significant offending history, and there's sort of the expectation that they're going to commit a violent crime again.
And what category would they go into? The place?
for this graph in particular,
They're not on that graph.
no, because this is already after they would have been sort of sent to
Right,
that adult
that's-
system. Yes.
But I wonder if that lowers then incarceration at the end of this, because those kids have already been moved into the adult system.
Yeah, for this visual, it would affect that number.
Ceceila, do you have a sense of how many people there are in a country like you? How many people want to do what you do?
Well, that is a good question. I have no idea.
That's honest.
I will say that most of my criminology classes have lots of familiar faces with the same students over and over again. I'm not really sure exactly how many students are like in the program at any given time, but you generally have classes with the same students, and they're not very large classes here at our university. So I'm not sure about other colleges, but it's definitely not the most popular major here at Iowa.
Are we the only school in the state that teaches these courses?
No, but we're the only public school that does, I believe. I know that Iowa State and UNI do not have programs for criminology. And there are also a lot of schools in Iowa and all over the country that have criminal justice systems, which are very similar. But the criminology aspect focuses a lot more on the social issues that are connected with how people end up committing crimes, rather than how the system works once you're in it, which is what some other programs focus on.
Okay.
So what happens when you go on and get your master's? What are your choices of things to do when you get into the real world?
Sort of the two broadest categories are either working for the government or working for other organizations like a nonprofit, and helping make policy, helping make changes. I don't necessarily have a preference between either of those two, but sort of my goal for myself is to sort of aid social justice, you know, whether it's helping youth have similar incarceration rates no matter what sex or race they are, or whether it's something involving the adult system, or maybe being thrown into one of the people who are trying to think of how to sort of reorganize our current law enforcement. There's a lot of topics that I've learned about in my classes that I'm super interested in. This is definitely at the top, but whichever jobs are available, one of them will hopefully be addressing social justice. It's sort of where my passions lie. Yeah, Liz?
If a youth is biracial, Caucasian and minority, which group do they get put into?
Whichever one the jail said.
I'm sorry,
Whichever one the jail said. They don't ask the youth.
Okay, so it's
Yeah, so yeah, the system sort of defines that for them, which is a little bit more complicated, especially because multiracial couples, people are always continuously becoming more common. So there's significantly more youth who are being grown up who don't have one label that is necessarily the one for them.
Research and see where they primarily output into the minority group as opposed to.
Yeah, which is part of the reason why the UK does do that sort of just white versus minority, because it sort of allows to surpass those questions and just pick two broader categories.
I do think, Ceceila, you're on your way to becoming a very valuable person in our society. We really need you to do your work as well as you possibly can. I mean, it's still, even though it's going down, it's still a horrific problem.
Thanks, Walter. I appreciate it.
Go for it. Wish you every success.
Well, I'm glad you said that after this, but this is the first presentation I've ever given by myself, so I couldn't have been that bad.